Okay, everybody. Good morning. Happy Friday to everybody. My name is Jonathan Elkind. I'm a fellow and senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. We are extremely pleased to see you all here today. One of the things that makes the evolutions in our energy economy both really hard to follow and also really interesting to follow is the fact that if you are looking at energy and climate issues around the globe, the story keeps changing, and it changes at what feels like a dismayingly rapid pace. No segment of the global energy economy, in turn, has evolved as much and continues to evolve faster than renewable energy. Sustained research, much of it supported in whole or in part by governments, including the U.S. government. It's kind of not a fashionable thing to say these days, but it's true. Sustained research plus technological learnings arising from larger and larger deployment of renewable energy systems has resulted in new versatility, reduced costs, broader options for renewable energy sources around the globe. In short, renewables are cheaper and more broadly usable than many of us would have ever expected a decade ago. This progress creates its own set of challenges. Today, we're trying to understand how to manage variability in the electricity sector based on renewable energy resources. We're trying to understand how far we can go in applying renewable systems in our companies, our cities, our states, and our nations. Should we be aiming for 70, 80, 90, 100% of our electricity systems, electricity supply coming from renewables? How do we think about old parts of the energy industry that are getting left behind as a consequence of these technological evolutions? How do we think in turn about the use of renewables in applications beyond power generation? Ones where we have not traditionally thought that renewables could be applied, such as thermal requirements for industry or transportation fuels. In this context, where we struggle to keep up with the pace of change, we need to be able to rely on solid sources of data, analysis, and trends. And this is where our guest and his institution, the International Energy Agency, come in. Founded in 1974 after the first Arab oil embargo, IEA was for a long time synonymous in many people's minds with the global oil market. In a way that's not surprising. After all, its very existence was triggered by an oil market problem. And indeed, the initial members of the IEA, all of them from wealthy countries that were members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they accounted for 60% of global oil demand at that time. The IEA's system for the maintenance of and willingness to use strategic oil stocks today remains one of the most well-known parts of the agency's work. Somewhat less well recognized is the fact that from the IEA's very first days, the member countries of IEA asked for it to think hard about what in those days, in the 70s and 80s, were referred to as alternative energy sources. Even from the very beginning, long before climate change emerged as arguably the great challenge of our time, the founders of the IEA, including the U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, saw clearly that a global economy dependent on oil would be precarious, subject to recurrent market, resource, political, and other perturbations, including, as we know today, very serious environmental challenges. Hamy Bahar is the Renewable Energy Markets Analyst at IEA, and so he is the person whose hand must constantly be on the pulse of what is happening in regards to renewable energy. Hamy has been at IEA since 2013, and before coming to IEA, he worked on trade and environment issues at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. including measures designed to promote renewables development and cross-border power trade issues. In prior roles, he had worked with World Bank, Vestas, the Danish wind power giant, and a number of other research organizations. He received his master's degree in Energy, Resources, and the Environment from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and a bachelor's from Sabancı University in Istanbul. This is now the fourth time that Hemi has been kind enough to come to Columbia University and the Center on Global Energy Policy to present the IEA's Renewables report, and we're exceptionally grateful for that, Hemi. And your persistence says something either about you like visiting New York or something. I don't know exactly what. Before I turn over to you for your presentation, let me just say a couple of words to those of you who are with us here today. Hemi will walk us through what is a very, very interesting presentation about an even more interesting market report. And I would encourage you to be thinking about questions to pose to him afterward. I might take the moderator's prerogative and do one or two myself, but then it'll be open to you, and I very much hope that we can have a really lively discussion. Please wait until a microphone comes to you. I think we have arrangement for mics to be brought. I'll check on that as Hemi does his presentation. Like all of the public events of the Center on Global Energy Policy, our session today is being webcast live. A full video and a podcast recording will be available on our website and on iTunes in the coming days. And last, we have a number of people who are watching online. They, as well as you here in the audience, can submit a question at any time using the hashtag CGEP events, like Center on Global Energy Policy events, and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. So please join me in welcoming Hemi Bahar for a presentation of IEA's Renewables 2018.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's nice to be here. I may be from SAIS, but I'm a big fan of SIPA work. So, I mean, there is no competition on that one. I was at SAIS 2 days ago, so to present the report. They are not jealous, so it's okay. So just to give you a little context about the report. We publish this report every year. It's the renewable energy forecast of the IEA. It looks at from 2018 to 2023. And we produced this in a team of 8-9 people in total with various contributors. And I would like you to present. I would like to present a few slides on the main findings and looking forward to discussion. Before I start the presentation, I would like to give you a little context of energy markets, which is very relevant, fresh from the IEA. So we were really happy in 2014, 15, and 16 because CO2 emissions were flat, were not growing, and then the world hoped that this will remain the same, and then everyone questions, are we coming to a point where emissions actually peaked? 2017 proved this to be wrong. Emissions increased again, and in 2018 we expect that emissions will increase again. Just to give you an idea, we are not going towards the direction of the Paris Climate Agreement, but away from it as of today. The second thing, another unfortunately bad news, is that our energy efficiency market report, which is released last week, found out that the progress in energy efficiency is slowing down. Just to give you another context here as well, in order to go towards the 2 degrees or below 2 degrees scenario, energy efficiency represents the majority of the gainings. So we are going towards the other direction. The third one, this can be considered good or bad for the renewables, but expensive energy is back, which means that we have higher oil prices, higher natural gas prices, higher coal prices, and this can be interpreted both ways for renewables, but it's a fact that is a change that proves the changing energy markets in the world. On the other hand, some good news. Last year, solar PV capacity broke another record. It actually is the largest growing electricity source in terms of capacity among all fuels, including coal, gas, or whatever you can think of. Offshore wind broke another record, mostly in Europe. And also we see an incredible auction price reductions on renewables ranging from $20 to $40 per megawatt hour. One point on global electricity. Global electricity demand is increasing much faster than global energy demand. This proves and continues electrification. But electricity only represents 20% of global energy consumption. So when we look at electricity, which I will repeat this many times in my presentation, the other side of the energy system is very, very important. And this report finds that this is the part that we really need to work on. And IEA started a series of blind spots which looks at the energy system or a consumption type in the energy system where it's growing very fast or it is already very big, but no one is talking about it. These are not usually sexy topics, but IEA wants to move them forward in order for the world to recognize their importance, either today or in the coming future. We released a report on petrochemicals. We released a report on various other blind spots. And this report's focus is bioenergy. And why this report's focused in bioenergy, this figure shows you very clearly. We all talk about solar PV and wind, which has a good success story. But when you look at the overall energy system, modern bioenergy, we call it modern because it excludes traditional use of biomass in the developing countries. We are talking about here modern sources and modern way of using bioenergy. It represents today 50% of renewable consumption globally. And this might be surprising to all of you, but the reason is on the other side of the graph, because bioenergy is the only technology that can be directly used in electricity, heat in buildings and industry, and transport. No other renewable energy can serve these three sectors at the same time. And obviously not to forget other renewables, they are mostly present in the electricity sector. As you can see in this figure, hydropower remains the largest source of electricity generation globally, followed by wind and solar. As you can see here, modern bioenergy consumption is 4 times larger than wind and solar combined today. I just want to draw your attention to the electricity from renewables part, which is a purple section of the graph. This is the renewable portion of electricity that is used for heating and transport. In transport, this is electric vehicles. In heating, this is electric heating that we use at homes. And then we basically portion out the renewable electricity part of it. And this was surprising. This was not surprising to us, this picture. What was surprising to us is actually the future. You can see here the renewable energy growth, total consumption in all sectors past 5 years and next 5 years. And in the next 5 years, bioenergy will continue to lead renewable energy consumption exactly for very reason that I mentioned in the previous slide, because of the transport and heat. And followed by solar PV and wind, which has similar growth rates, and hydropower remains stable. Total renewable energy consumption in our forecast, we expect to grow by 30%, which is a significant growth in the coming 5 years. But it will only cover 40% of the global energy demand growth. I'll come to that in the next slide, that this actually means only a small increase in the percentage. Several different sectors for renewables basically have different performances. These are the share of renewables in each sector. And as you can see, electricity is a success story of it. And it will continue to increase by 1 percentage point each year in the coming 5 years to reach 30% in 2023. A success story, good news. But when we look at the 2 other sectors, they are basically falling behind. We expect renewables share in heat consumption to increase only from 10 to 12%. And for transport, as you can see, it basically remains flat. The reason why it remains flat, because global energy demand continues to increase. When we put all these sectors together in a weighted average way, we see that the share of renewables in total energy consumption is around today 10.4%, and in the coming 5 years, it will only increase to 12.5%. So it's an increase by 1/5. And as you can see, the red figure is very close to the heat, because heat is the largest consumer of renewable energy. Transport sector's low share pushes the share of total renewables down. The performance in the electricity sector pushes it up. Heat remains stable. So that's why it's very close to the heat section. That's why IEA wants to draw the attention that sectors outside of electricity are extremely important for decarbonization. Just to give you an idea, context about what does this 12.4% mean. If we had to basically project this forecast trend forward, we will reach about 18 to 19% in 2040. And when you look at IEA's last year's sustainable development scenario, which is in line with long-term climate targets, it's about 28%. So we will be about 10 percentage points short of it if we continue this trend. So it's very far away from the 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees target that is agreed in the Paris Agreement. When we look at the performance of the countries, today the largest consumer of renewable energy is European Union because of its strong policies on 2020 targets, followed by China due to the electricity sector, the strong renewables in the electricity sector, US and Brazil. In the next 5 years, the picture will change. We will see that China becoming the leader of renewable energy consumption including all sectors. This is a very important point to make because China's ambition on renewable energy is not only related to climate change, it's also related to air pollution. They would like to fight the air pollution because it's a significant concern in the country. I would like to draw your attention to one important point here, to Brazil and the red dot. Brazil's share of renewables is by far the highest among world energy, large energy consumers, 45%. Why is that? The reason is basically bioenergy use in the transport sector. Brazil is one of the largest producers of biofuels, ethanol, and it's the largest consumer of it among the large economies. And there's also a significant hydropower in the electricity system. When you combine those two, you see that Brazil is about 45% of renewables share, which is by far the highest. On the other side of the picture, the other three large economies, China, US, and India, by 2023 will remain about 12% only. Let's move to electricity a little bit. Every year we look at what policies drive the electricity growth in renewables. And then we looked at two different types of policies. Those policies that are administratively set, which means government giving feed-in tariffs or fixed price, or by competitively set. We see an important policy shift in the electricity sector. We did this analysis last year, and we had 40% only, or 38% just to be exact, of capacity coming online in the next 5 years in our last year's forecast to come from competitively set mechanisms. In our new year's forecast, or this year's forecast, we see this move towards more competitive schemes, about 60%. This is the reason is simple, because China is moving towards from feed-in tariffs to auctions or RPS mechanism with certificate systems. So that's why it is an important shift in our forecast. This also creates a lot of uncertainties, by the way. But also many other countries introduced auctions because on the other side of the graph, the prices that were achieved in the auctions were significant. As you can see, this is the onshore wind, which is reached by commissioning date, which reached between $30 to $50 in the last few years to be coming online in next decade, basically. We had an incredible improvements in offshore wind, mainly in Europe, the recent auction prices created this incredible competition in the supply chain and reduced costs significantly. Solar PV obviously is a success story. Now the auction results are comparable to onshore wind. And we'll also look at the bioenergy, which is fluctuating because of the technology diversity that is used. However, these are the announced contract prices. Talking about they are competitive and the deal is over is far from being there. Looking at the competition of renewables is something else. You need to look at the levelized cost of energy on average. These are the selected projects, which only represents about 10% of our forecast in the coming forwards. Other 90% will be announced auction prices, and these auction prices need to be checked and verified if they are delivered on time and they are actually deployed. This is our forecast 15 years back and next 5 years. The right side of the figure. As you can see here, I mean, China obviously emerges as the largest deployer of renewable capacity globally. It represents about 40%, followed by European Union and United States. So unfortunately, we revised down our United States forecast this year compared to last year, and we improved our European Union forecast due to the policy changes. That's why we see a shift this year. United States was the second largest growth market. Now it's the third largest growth market. We can discuss the reasons in the discussion. There's an India picture here, which is a big consumer of renewable energy, and it's basically driven by solar PV targets and the auctions with very competitive prices, followed by Africa and Middle East, which is an important growing market as well, Japan, Brazil. I would like to draw your attention to the other. Other is growing as well, which means that renewables are moving very fast in different countries with the increasing competition and policy support. This is our main case. We also have an accelerated case. We go country by country, look at the policies, and look at the challenges. And there are three major challenges that every country faces in different forms. These are policy uncertainties or policy or administrative uncertainties. These are grid integration or network availability issues, and affordable financing. And we look at if countries tackle these challenges or some of these challenges in the coming 12 to 24 months, what will the electricity market, renewable electricity market look like? And we see a 25% more growth in this case, mainly driven by, again, China, US, and European Union in terms of the upside, but also significant upside in Africa because of the current uncertainties and problems related to affordable financing. Overall, this growth represents about 70% of global capacity growth when you look at all fuels. It's an impressive growth. And every time that we talk about capacity, people criticize us, saying that why are you not talking about generation? I can give you that number as well. In terms of generation, it's about 66% of the growth, so it's very similar. Because of the renewables are taking majority of the global power demand growth, that's why the other fuels are consumed, their share declines. That was the geographic picture. Now let's look at the technology picture, which is also very interesting. This is, again, last 10 years. As you can see, the picture looked different in terms of the technologies, but solar PV became the leader in terms of growth in the last 5 years, followed by wind and hydropower. Solar PV consolidates this growth in the next 5 years. As you can see in the picture, it becomes the winning technology in terms of the growth. It's actually growth is combined, equals to all renewables combined in the next 5 years. Why is that? Is it the cheapest option? Not necessarily everywhere. But what is the reason? Is because of the distributed generation part that you see here. If you look at only utility scale projects, it's very similar to wind. When you add on top residential, industrial, and commercial applications, solar PV becomes the winning model. Just to give you one important point of analysis that we did, that we have been discussing in the morning, why it's the winning technology, although sometimes it's more expensive. Because it addresses to everyone. You can install a solar PV plant for 1 watt panel to a 500 megawatt utility scale project. And one important point, it doesn't have a height, which means that any technology like wind has a height, has difficulties in terms of permitting and challenges. So solar PV's diversity of modularity and in terms of the size options also is open to any investors. As an individual, you can invest in a solar panel, or as the largest utility, you can invest in a solar panel. Distributed PV also represents majority of the accelerated case we have, because we see this as a black box. If you have the right conditions in terms of the cost reductions versus the regulatory environment, you can see an incredible growth of distributed PV. We can discuss this in the discussion, but we see this as an important trend going forward. Talking about distributed PV, we also looked at the policies that drive distributed PV, like we did for the competition and regulatory schemes. This is the first time that we did this analysis, and then we divided up several remuneration schemes for distributed PV. All generation fixed with feed-in tariff, retail tariff, this is the net metering, wholesale price, or value-based tariff. Everyone is talking about net metering in the US. Yes, it is the majority of the driver in the US, but this is not true globally. As you can see, 50% of the growth that will actually come from fixed tariffs, which means that you generate, you sell it to the grid as a residential or commercial customer, and you get a fixed price. This price can be higher than your retail tariff or lower than wholesale tariff. It depends on how policy is set up. I'd like to highlight one attention here is value-based tariff. What do we mean by value-based tariff? It's a new policy shift as well. I'd like to highlight this, that it's like in the utility scale from administratively set to feed-in, administratively set tariffs to auctions and competition. In the distributed PV, is moving from retail tariff or net metering or fixed tariffs towards a value-based tariff. What is a value-based tariff? Value-based tariff is where you define the price that you give by variety of reasons. This is the regulatory authority defines that. In the US, in some states, it's called avoided cost of generation or avoided cost of new distribution lines that is factored in this price. In Australia, it's the avoided CO2 that is included as a premium. These are the benefits, but some people can also include costs, which means that how much does it cost actually to the system to integrate those renewables. So there's a new trend. There is no one formula. There are many formulas floating around depending on the context and context of the country. We also have an important question that we ask in the book. Will utilities lose a lot of money? There's a lot of discussion in the United States and many parts of the world due to the distributed generation growth. Will utilities go bankrupt? The answer to that, I'll leave it to you. We run the numbers for the only self-consumption part, which means that you generate and you self-consume, which means you don't pay utility the part that you consumed yourself and produced. We calculated that in 2023, utilities will lose about 12 billion euros a year globally. But just to give you a context, this is about less than 0.3% of global retail bill collection business. So it's very little. It will remain very little. But I would like to make the point that this is global number. When you look at certain cities where utilities have a large scale of distributed generation growth, for instance, in Australia, in some cities, rooftop penetration is about 60 to 65%. Obviously, that utility will be affected more. Or in California, some of the utilities will be affected more. It depends on where you are and how the regulation is structured. Few points on biofuels. Now we are moving towards transport. So we expect biofuels to continue to grow in the coming 5 years, about 16%. And most of the growth is expected in Latin America and Asia. And 2020 year, the year of 2020, is basically an important year for policy shift in few countries. In Brazil, Renewable bio policy comes online, which is an important driver for the growth. In China, the new mandates are coming online in 2020. And in India, also, implementation of the mandates will be more strict. I'd like to highlight your attention to ASEAN. The driver of biofuels in ASEAN countries is basically driven by energy security in order to reduce oil imports. United States production remains stable or stabilizes because of the current policy environment in place. I'd like to make a point that 2 weeks ago, new administration made an announcement to change the policy. This is not included in this forecast. So we will assess that next year. We already published the book, unfortunately. We did not forget electric vehicles and other sectors. When you look at renewables in the whole transport system, road biofuels represent about 85%. And it will remain in a similar trend in 2023. You have other sectors, such as aviation biofuels, maritime biofuels, very small, and will remain, unfortunately, very small. And there are a lot of talk about electric vehicles. Their consumption will triple in just 5 years. But in terms of the share in overall renewable transport, will remain, as you can see, quite small. And then most of this electric vehicle consumption is not coming from cars. I know that Tesla is a very good vibe in the world, but most of it is coming from 2, 3-wheelers, motorbikes, and tuk-tuks in Asia, and buses in Asia, and majority actually in China, not in the United States or Europe. And rail electricity today is much bigger than electric vehicles and will remain much bigger in terms of it. And if you have an idea that electric vehicles are renewable, this is obviously totally wrong. Only 30% of their electricity consumption will come from renewables in 2023. The rest will be mostly fossil fuels. So electric vehicles have incredible benefits in terms of air pollution, obviously, but how you fuel them is also important. We also looked at a sector which represents, I think this is also another blind spot, but we can't have too many blind spots in one book. This is aviation. And currently the biofuels used in aviation is very little, and because they are more expensive. The cost premium at $70 when we did this analysis, now it's more than $80, was about 40% difference in terms of cost price. And what we did, we turned this cost premium into per passenger per flight. And we looked at from London to these destinations, how much it will cost if passengers paid. And from London to New York, it's about $10 per ticket. This is about probably 3 to 4% of the economy ticket and less than 1% of a business class ticket. I leave it to you to judge if it's expensive or not expensive and so on and so forth. And the point here is that IEA does not argue that passengers should pay. Just give you an idea of the scale. It should be a combination of industry, policymakers, and passengers in this case, if you want to go towards that. This is the average fleet of today's airplanes. When you look at the efficiency improvements, which means that the new planes, if we had all new planes running this cost premium, it will be 15% lower without any change in policy. Sorry. We look at, now we are moving to heat, which is the unforgotten giant of our energy system. We look at buildings and industry separately. When I say heat, for buildings it's the heating of the building, but for industries, industrial processes. Today, 50% of renewable consumption is basically in buildings, 50% in the industry. The picture of bioenergy looks different here. As you can see, bioenergy is much prominent in the industry because of it has ability to reach the high temperature levels that other renewables cannot. In the other technologies contribute mostly on the building side, and for the first time, other technologies combined, such as geothermal, solar thermal, is basically surpassing in 2023 bioenergy use in buildings. As you can see in the industry, bioenergy remains the largest consumer of all. I would like to highlight one important point here, electrification. The blue bars show you how electrification will move forward. As you can see, there's an incredible increase in building sector about the electrification of heat and an important chunk in industry. And this is the renewable portion of electricity that will be consumed. So it's an important trend to talk about, which actually World Energy Outlook will have a focus on electrification, and then more to come on this topic in the World Energy Outlook. Industry obviously is the most difficult sector to decarbonize. And we looked at the sector which is the third largest consumer is cement in the world, and looked at how different countries use bioenergy and waste in the cement industry. And then we realized that in EU, 25% of the cement production is coming from basically uses renewables and waste. In Germany and UK, it's about 50%. So there is no technical problems in using waste and renewables or bioenergy in cement factories. In China and India, though, which are the largest producer of cement, the shares are very low. So we would like to highlight an important potential here, which we calculated. If waste management policies that are used in Europe and in the United States or any other OECD countries, which actually prices the waste. You can't simply dump the waste somewhere or burn it on the field. It is collected and it has a price. You can't just simply burn it. In many of these countries, waste management policies are unfortunately not that developed, and we argue that it's a great opportunity to produce greener cement. And that's why we highlighted this potential. And if this potential is realized through good waste management policies, the bioenergy and waste use, the share of their use in cement industry can double in just 5 years. It's an important opportunity that we want to highlight. Putting all the picture together, all the accelerated cases and potential we calculated, this is my last slide. We look at electricity as I showed. It represents an important chunk in our accelerated case, half of it coming from solar PV. Bioenergy part of the electricity is basically driven by waste-to-energy projects in Asia. Asia has an important urbanization growth, and then urbanization means more collected waste, and if you use that waste to produce energy, it's a great opportunity. On the other hand, we put together our road transport biofuels accelerated case and our cement accelerated case, which I showed. We looked at sugar and ethanol industry. We looked at the aviation sector. And then we actually realized that bioenergy's potential is very similar to electricity accelerated case. And majority of this accelerated case does not require any new crop development in the field. It's mostly based on waste, which is wasted. That's why we want to raise that waste is gold, because we are not using it. For instance, many parts of the sugar-producing countries, the sugar cane residues or agriculture residues are left on the field or burned because it's not collected, is not mobilized to use somewhere else to produce heat and power. That's why we are trying to emphasize here that it is important to use this waste. It's a low-hanging fruit of bioenergy to be exploited. Few points on the conclusions. I talked about distributed energy policies and utility scale policies on renewables, which they are transforming. The cost of renewables have declined. We all agree. Are they competitive? In some places, yes. Does this mean that we should stop policies? The answer is no. Because the policies remain important to give them not a lot of money, but to basically create a framework that they can operate in our energy markets, especially in the electricity markets, to transform them that they can operate in a level of playing field, because they are different technologies. And it's important to make sure that we have right market designs to attract investment, and we have the right market designs for the system integration. Modern bioenergy, according to our forecast, will continue to lead the growth in the coming 5 years, and there's a lot of untapped potential in several big countries such as China, India, Brazil, and the European Union. But one important point, I never talked about it, probably will talk about it in discussion. Sustainability of bioenergy remains key if you want to use it. And this is not a topic which is not being discussed. We are well aware that bioenergy use is a controversial topic in many parts of the world, But there are also a lot of good policy examples, such as in Brazil, such as in European Union, such as in California, which takes into account all life cycle emissions of bioenergy and then design policies accordingly. If you look at the recent IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, you will see that the bioenergy plays an important role in it. The reason is very simple, because if you want to go towards 1.5 degrees, you need it, especially to decarbonize aviation, decarbonize shipping, decarbonize many parts of the heating system. Some few policy suggestions. As I said, we need all renewables in all sectors. We need more electrification. We need more energy efficiency. We need more enhanced direct renewable heat uses and stronger penetration in the industry. Thank you very much for listening.
Good. Well, Amy, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. I will say, as a public service announcement for those of you who have not yet read the report itself, it is well worth your time. It is a very, very interesting read with lots of elements in it that are individual nuggets that really will cause a lot of thought and reflection. I'm going to start the Q&A session, get us rolling, but as I said earlier, I very much encourage you to be active participants, and so that means questions. When I will recognize you to pose a question, please introduce yourself by name and affiliation, and please actually keep it to a question so that we can get lots of discussion and interaction going on among us. Let me start, though, just with one topic that frequently comes up and I think is important to characterize. I made the remark in my opening comments that IEA is, in many people's minds, very much associated with legacy fuels, the oil industry in particular. And there is a range of different approaches, methodologies, and findings that one comes across, particularly in the renewables space, if one is looking at work such as you have just presented, or work coming from other sources like the International Renewable Energy Agency or the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Organization, et cetera. Could you help us to understand ways in which your approach and others differ? What is the approach that IEA takes? Are these predictions? Are they projections? What's the difference? Help us, take us through that, if you will, please.
First of all, one thing that differentiates IEA from all these other organizations, it has an all-fuel, all-sector approach. You will see that it's the only analysis in the short term that I presented that you will see renewables in all sectors together. And most of the IEA analysis try to go towards that direction. Some of the analysis only looks at electricity, not without looking at heat. They only look at other parts of the energy system, but not the others. So IEA has this kind of an approach to have a view of different fuels and different sectors. So first, I would like to make that one. Our approach on the, most of the criticism to the IEA is based on the electricity sector, because no one is actually working on heat and transport. Very few countries or very few companies work on those, which represent 80% of the global energy consumption, by the way. So our approach on the electricity side is very thorough. We go country by country, and we look at policies, drivers, and we look at, on the one side, opportunities, and on the other side, the challenges. Policy challenges, administrative challenges, regulatory challenges. And then we assess the country's target or policy goals based on their track record of if they are able to reach it, or they are not able to reach it. Just to give you an example, China always overreaches their target, but some of the Middle Eastern countries, they announce big targets, but in the end, the implementation of these targets are small. We take that into account. IEA's role in this case, looking at the policies, how they have an impact, and giving a message to the world that if you implement these policies, you will go towards that direction. If you implement better solutions for the challenges that we raised, in the book you will see a lot of word challenges, you will go towards the accelerated case. Just to give you one example, last year in this room, I presented a slide on China solar PV. And I said, China is the shining star of solar PV, okay? But the world is too dependent on China, because China is not only the supply, which we already knew, but now it's also the demand side of it. And we said that we have to be very careful, because if China changes its policy, the solar PV markets can be affected. What happened in last May? China changed their solar PV policy, put a ban on the deployment, tried to slow down the deployment, and in the end, we raised this uncertainty, and it happened. It's an important point to make that IEA's role, as I said, is to raise these uncertainties and give the governments what is the better way of designing the policies.
Thank you very much. That's really useful as backdrop to the discussion. And maybe let's start with the bioenergy themes a little bit, because I think that really is a feature of this report that is different from where the predominant emphasis has been in the past, but it's also different from how many of us, including myself, have a kind of a knee-jerk tendency to think renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, et cetera. Tell us a little bit, please, about what forms of modern bioenergy you are capturing predominantly, and maybe some of the relative shares. Sure. Some of this came out in the presentation, but I'd like you to just give us a little bit of an elaboration. Sure. That's one. And secondly, can you dig in on the sustainability challenges that you were referring to, and some of the most effective ways that different countries around the globe are managing those challenges?
So when we say modern bioenergy, we include all forms of solid, gaseous, and liquid bioenergy.
And I'm sorry, I'll interrupt just to say that I'm now encouraging you all to be preparing those questions for when this is done. Please.
So we use all forms of and modern uses, which means modern technologies. So we do not include in this case if you are cooking with a waste bioenergy in a developing country, it's not included in there. We have biogas, we have ethanol, we have diesel, we have wood pellets, we have wood chips, we have agricultural residues, we have municipal waste, we have renewable waste. We include everything that is used in the modern technology. That's one part of it, the definition. One note on traditional use of biomass, which is not included in this report. This is an energy access work that IEA is doing. It's extremely important. Actually, 2/3 of bioenergy use is coming from traditional uses, not modern uses, which is a policy issue. It needs to be declined because it has health effects. This is a thing that it shouldn't decrease. It should actually decline. So our long-term outlooks are looking at these kind of policies, how it should be declined, outside of this report. In terms of sustainability, we are well aware that bioenergy is a very controversial topic with a lot of myths and facts around the world. It's basically a difficult technology. It is difficult to understand. I hope we tried our best to make it much more easier for people to understand. But it's a topic where people think they know, but they actually don't know. It's different than wind and solar. It actually has a feedstock. Because you have it's not like wind is blowing or sun is shining and then you produce electricity. You actually need a feedstock. You need to mobilize that feedstock. And the way that you use that feedstock is very diverse. You can simply have a biomass boiler at your place, at home. You can also have You can also have waste-to-energy systems where you can produce heat and electricity, or you can use animal fats to produce advanced biofuels. So it is kind of probably there are 20 different technologies that you can use bioenergy. All of them are included in our report. On the sustainability side, there are bad examples which are actually in our forecasts. We are not saying that all our forecast is sustainable. The growth that I mentioned in Southeast Asia, biodiesel growth, is coming from palm oil production. But it is a market report. We also capture that and we have a clear, as an IEA, is a clear point on this. It shouldn't grow, it shouldn't continue. It should grow towards a more sustainable production of palm oil. One important point to make, palm oil production that is used for fuel, biodiesel, is only 10% of palm oil consumption. The other 90% is the food that we eat every day, the makeup that you use every day, and any other retail products that we use. On the other side, there are very, very good bioenergy policies, sustainability policies, and countries should implement those policies. And this is not a very, it's been developed for a very long time. And it has to be simply implemented in a way that a good forestry management, a better life cycle assessment of the bioenergy sources, a better use of agriculture and forestry residues, which are actually, some of them needs to be left on the field because it is actually important for the soil, but there's a lot that is burned in the open field in many sugar-producing countries, for instance. So it has to be used. And we did the potential of this, and it's very large, actually, this waste potential, residue potential. And we need to use that. And one important sentence, and my highlight, is that any bioenergy that doesn't bring life cycle emission reductions shouldn't be used. It's very simple. It needs to reduce the life cycle emissions. There's no other way of going forward.
Thank you very much for that. There is maybe a challenge that we might come back to in the discussion where temporary habits become something more approximating permanent, and there may be a kind of political economy challenge, whether one is talking about palm oil or corn-based ethanol or others. But maybe let's come back to that. I see over here a question, and then I've got a couple more. So this gentleman here with the beard is our first. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation and your question, and then let me, while you're getting ready to speak, let me remind those who are watching online that you can submit a question using hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle, which is @ColumbiaUEnergy. Please.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. Joseph Curtin is my name. I work for a think tank called the IEA, not to be confused with the IEA.
Okay.
It's a Dublin-based think tank. My question, I suppose, was does the International Energy Agency look at the overall amount of investment in dollar terms and those trends over time? I mean, in the big picture, 2015 seems to have, or 2016 following the Paris Agreement, seems to have been a good year for renewables. 2017 seems to have been a bad year, just in big picture terms, possibly related to the US presidential election. And I'm just wondering, what would you say about 2018 in that context? And that maybe relates to a second very quick question. What is behind the changing projections for renewables in the US, which you referred to the changing forecast compared to last year? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Very good. Two questions. So the first one, sorry. The renewable investment was about 298 billions in 2017, I think, if I remember correctly. The reason why it stabilized or slightly declined is because of the cost reduction of solar PV. Because solar PV actually represents majority of this investment. If you look at how much capacity was deployed in 2017, it was on all renewables. It was about 176 gigawatts, I think, if I remember correctly, and 97 of it was solar PV alone. And why 97? Because 53 was in China, so China represented majority of it. 2017 number is basically related to the cost reduction of solar PV. Actually, we had larger capacity deployed, but lower investment. It's a good news. 2018 is a big question mark. Again, a very uncertain year for renewables. Why? Because of policy change in China. We do not know what's going to happen in solar PV market in China. Everyone, including us, expects a decline, which means a global decline, more or less, because in a short period of time, the other countries cannot install that fast. So overall investment may be declining again due to two reasons. One is basically due to the continuous cost reduction, because the fact that demand decline, we have kind of an oversupply situation right now. The price of modules declined again significantly in 2018. That's an important point to make, which will affect the deployment on the investment side. And on the other hand, we may see, in our main case, we see solar PV annual market declining in 2018, but in our accelerated case, we see a slight increase. So that's an uncertainty there. Just one number on overall investment. In the next 5 years, the overall 5-year investment of renewables will be about 1.3 to 1.4 trillion, if I remember correctly, just to give you a scale of the number. Yeah. US, very important. So there are 3 developments in the US that made us revise slightly down our forecasts. One is the corporate tax change. What happened in the US is that, as you all know, corporate taxes was reduced. This may seem very good development. However, when you look at the other side of the picture, when the incentive is a tax credit in the United States, the value of tax credit also reduced, which means that it becomes more difficult and expensive to finance projects. And during this tax reform, and at the same time on top, which is the second reason, is the import tariffs on PV and solar modules and steel, created an uncertainty. And people, when there's an uncertainty, developers wait. They wait because they don't know what the price is going to be. More than the increase in terms of the price because of the tariffs, actually the main issue is that this uncertainty, because in the United States, you run with a phase-out schedule of the. That's how we included this in our forecast. This is the main reason why we had a slight decline. Also, after 2021, the policy, Clean Power Plan being not there anymore, and uncertainty of what is going to come after the Clean Power Plan remains us a little bit empty, what's going to happen to renewables in the last 2 years of our forecast. That's why we had a conservative approach.
And I'd say just that you made the point in your presentation that policy frameworks, policy support are important for the renewables sector. But the flip side of that is that policy instability also can be
very important, yeah.
But in a negative fashion. Please, sir.
Thank you. Gabriel Avgerinos, Energy Mentors International, previously Poten and Partners. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I'd like to ask you more of a big picture question as how it relates to your forecast, and that is, since you've looked at policies, you said country by country, for the next 5 years, have you taken into account 2 things? One, carbon price or tax in the various regions, or more specifically in countries, especially in places like China, in view of what's going on with their emissions trading system that they're rolling out this year. So that's number one. And number 2, the evolving and necessary technology change for battery storage and what impact that might have on renewables. And the third component, which is also, I think, important in view of your attention to bioenergy, is the waste-to-energy component for cities. Is there any restrictions that you have to point out to us in terms of the feedstock, in terms of the waste composition? Because I've worked with people in Sweden, which are big promoters of waste-to-energy, and they have come up with serious conclusions as to you have to be careful to include recycling and what kind of recycled waste goes into the feedstock for waste-to-energy, because you need to have, I believe, high carbon content recyclable.
Very good. And let's go ahead.
Yes, carbon price, we included, especially on the heat sector. we include the carbon price, and it affects the model to adjust the competitiveness of renewables. But in the next 5 years, the impact of carbon price is quite limited because it's only in few regions. In our long-term outlooks, it has a more important impact.
Can you share a number with us?
Oh, I don't remember. Whatever it exists, we take that into account in various countries. The other one, technology change. We take into account when we calculate the output, the technology change of wind turbines, for instance. They are producing more energy. We take into account the improvements in the capacity factors of offshore wind, for instance, and solar PV. So we take that into account. In terms of the battery storage, this is a renewable energy report, but we looked at it this year. We looked at the pumped hydro storage, which is actually the much larger than the battery storage, which is a growing trend in many countries for the increasing the flexibility of the system. In terms of the growth, we see that actually stationary battery storage, including behind the meter, around 2018, 2019, the annual market will be much larger than pumped hydro in the annual market. In the overall, pumped hydro is huge, obviously. But when you look at the energy content of it, pumped hydro plants are by far, not even comparable, right? Waste to energy, yes, we are aware, it's not discussed in the book. Probably in the next sections we will look at those, in next editions. We did not look at it very closely on the recycling, how much should be recycled, how much should be used, so we'll probably look at it in the future.
Great, please.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Juan Carlos Espinosa. I'm a graduate student here at Columbia University, and I come from Mexico, so my particular case of interest is Mexico. And since, I'm going to stand up. Yeah. Since Mexico became the first member of the International Energy Agency, the first Latin American country to become a member, that was thanks to a lot of policy driven by the government to deregulate a lot of the energy regulations that had been holding the country in terms of DG or other issues. But now the new government has announced that they're thinking about absorbing the Regulatory Energy Commission into the Secretary of Energy, which would actually kind of take a lot of independence from them. And then, because also our utility is state-owned, so yes. Even the state-owned utility filed a case against the Regulatory Commission because they didn't want DG. Of course, we know why. But what's your approach into this? Because in the end, Mexico is not a big energy market like India, yes. Brazil, or China. But what's your approach on this?
Very good question. We basically did not take that change into account because it's too recent. But one thing about Mexico, energy reform, electricity market reform in general in Mexico, we follow it very closely, and we think it's a success story because it's the only market in the world today which combines competitive green certificates versus long-term contracts and short-term balancing market, and a competitive system which takes into account the location of the renewables and hourly adjustments to their generation profile. So it's a new approach that as the IEA we would like to see more and more in the market design. And we will see if it's a successful or not, but the idea is very good. And the result of the first plants are coming online is very good. I cannot comment on if this will be changed or not, but as the IEA, it's one of the good examples of how market design should evolve.
And I would just offer from my perspective, having for 8 years served on the governing board of the IEA when I was in government service under the Obama administration, watching that energy market reform process unfold was one of the most exciting things, exciting aspects of the job that I had, and I think the sense that you just expressed there, Jaime, about the positive elements of the enabling elements that the reform has brought to the Mexican economy. It's my personal hope that as the new team comes in, it's consistent with that old adage that governing is different than running for office. Maybe they will look at some of the new opportunities that are being created in terms of the economy of Mexico and might think a little bit differently about rolling back the clock. We'll see. Please, sir, you're next.
Robert Gurman, thank you very much. I'm a clean energy consultant for the New York Green Bank, NYSERDA, and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So go SAIS. My question is, offshore wind has been a huge success in Europe, 15 gigawatts going up to perhaps 25 in the next 5 years. And the United States, hopefully it's become a thing, but not for sure, and certainly individual states, regulatory support dependent. What did you factor for U.S. offshore wind growth? Thank you.
Thank you. U.S. forecast for offshore wind is about 1 gigawatts in 2023, 800 megawatts, something like this. We took into account, we take out the canceled project, I don't remember the name, last year, which was about 467 megawatts, I think, but we added 2 new projects off the coast of the East Coast into our forecast. So the success of Europe, just to mention one point, why the prices went down so much, because Europe changed the approach, learned from the challenges. What they did is that the government did more work than it was doing before, which means they designated the area, they looked at the soil and the geological, geophysical conditions, they basically assessed the resource, and they basically defined an area which is already given to the companies. Look, this is all the information you have the permits, we are okay to build you there, just bid for the price. So what you do with this approach, you take out all the uncertainties about permitting, about whatever you can think of, like fishermen's issues, all these issues. The government already dealt with those. That's why you saw an incredible price decline in the European Union. That's the main reason. So the risk is taken away, and one important point, that transmission is built by the government. So that's why it's a good success. In the US, it's a little bit more complicated, these things. But it was like this in Europe as well. But in the end, the countries stepped up, and then they said, look, we deal with it. That was a success. The countries who did not do that, there are a lot of delays still. We will see.
So I noticed in your cost projection graph, especially in offshore wind, if I recall correctly, but also in some of the other renewables categories, you showed an upward blip toward the end of the projection period. I'm curious as to why? What's the uptick?
So these are the average auction prices. So these are not the costs. These are the auction contract prices. And the reason the upwards on offshore wind is the French expansive projects coming online in 2023. That puts them up. Or the onshore wind, there are few countries in 21, 22, Mexico's $17 projects are coming online. That's why it's so low. Then there are other projects which were more expensive, about $30 to $35. That's why the graph moves up. This graph will change every year, obviously, when we have more projects. This is project by project graph.
I see. Okay. Very, very useful. Yeah. We're going to come to this gentleman here, but I want to ask you to dig in on one topic which we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is cost comparisons. One often hears in regard to renewable power. Well, I'll point this at myself. Every year I wait for the November issuing by Lazard of their levelized cost of electricity new assessment that puts different categories of resource, whether you're talking about combined cycle gas or oil or subcritical coal or whatever the case may be, renewables, PV, utility scale, et cetera, puts them side by side. It's the US market, and you come up with the picture wherein on an LCOE basis, you have lower costs today for onshore wind, solar PV utility scale than you do for some of the conventional fuels, including combined cycle natural gas, depending on the location. So, are those figures an accurate reflection of the cost of actually constructing and operating? And B, if they are, then why are we even having a conversation any longer about the comparative role of renewable power as opposed to other sources of power?
So this is a very interesting question, and it's in the book. We ask the same question: will renewables be competitive with gas and coal in 2023? So first of all, we need to differentiate whether it's for new plants or an existing plants. If you are talking about an existing fossil fuel plant, especially a coal plant, the generation costs are very cheap. So we are talking about very low costs. On that sense, new renewables to compete with them, it's very, very difficult. One important point. So according to our analysis, based on the levelized cost of energy, we see an incredible improvement of wind and solar compared to new natural gas and coal plants. In places where the natural gas is expensive, already solar and wind plants, such as in India, such as in China, are cheaper than natural gas, because the gas there is very expensive. I wouldn't say the same thing for coal. In some Indian states, solar PV bids lower prices than coal, but talking about this as an overall thing, it's very early, but in the next very coming future, it may well be that good resources, because renewables are based on resource, because in India the resource is not the same, and neither in the United States. So that's why it will become more and more competitive. In Europe, wind is the cheapest way of producing new energy, no doubt about this, for instance. But the question remains, why then, if it's improving and it's many places already the case, why we have 80 gigawatts of coal power plants under construction in Asia, why we are still deploying natural gas plants in the United States, right? This is the question. The answer to that is, first of all, there are many drivers of these investments. It's not only simply the LCOE. And there are many political reasons for these improvements, employment reasons for these deployments. I mean, we are not talking about pure competitive markets. The other point that I want to make is that that you will also see in our upcoming World Energy Outlook, we need to take into account the value of this generation, which means LCOE is only one part of it. If you think that the developers are deploying anything based on LCOE, you are obviously wrong, because they take into account various sources, the future cost of the CO2, for instance, they should take into account. They should take into account policy changes. They should think about prices in the future, so on and so forth. For the renewables as well, the policy changes. And what I mean by value, which means that when you talk about LCOE, is only one metric. When you talk about value, is that how much they bring value to the system. Do they generate when they are needed? This is an important factor. And one important point that renewables are a completely different technology than fossil fuels. They have high investment cost, low operation maintenance cost. The other side, fossil fuels plants, is the opposite. They have low investment cost, high operation and maintenance cost. So if you want to attract a renewable plant, you need to make sure that people can cover their investment. So based on a pure volatile electricity market, this will be a little bit tough. You need a different market design that reflects their value.
The value point, our colleague from NYSERDA will know this better than I, but as I have heard it from some of his colleagues, some of the particular challenges of delivering power when it's needed in a state like New York, where you've got a very narrow neck of land moving to where the demand center is from where the potential supply is upstate, a really big challenge. So the value orientation is very interesting. Sir, I think you're next, Patrick. Oh, very good. Thank you.
Pepe Banda with Energy Transition New York. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm very much interested in the biofuel part of it. I have a couple of questions. One is, what would be the net balance of emissions from biofuel in the scenario that you presented? It's out of my ignorance. I don't know how much greenhouse emissions are produced by biofuel. And the second question is in that optimistic scenario that you projected using more biofuel, as I understood, what would be the percentage coming from waste, more or less?
Okay. So on the first question, net balance of emissions in our forecast, in the short term, we do not do this analysis. It's a long-term analysis that we do. But we did an interesting analysis this year based on the emissions, tailpipe emissions of the cars if you use biofuels versus diesel. And just to give you a quick outlook on that, it was an interesting results. We figured out that if you use biofuels, biodiesel, in countries where the average age of the cars are very old and trucks, which means they are using very low emission standards, biofuels bring immediate emissions reduction in terms of many types of emissions compared to diesel. And this is an important point. You can argue that it's a transitional thing. If you have an old fleet, the cars, they are not going away, or the trucks. But if you are in a new fleet, the difference is very low because all cars have new filters and so on and so forth. So we basically pointed out that if you have an old fleet, such as in many countries in Latin America and many countries in Asia, or where the new car standards are very low, such as in Indonesia, you really have an opportunity to use biodiesel instead of diesel, like blending them, in order to make achieve immediate emissions gains and air pollution gains. That's the one thing. The other question was on proportion of waste. I do not know the answer of that question, but I think we separated out for the power in few Asian countries in the book, and waste is the majority, if I remember correctly. We looked at closely in China, Thailand, India, and then we separated out energy from waste and other technologies, and if I remember correctly, it's the largest portion.
I'm pausing to see whether anybody has questions. If you don't, I will. I'd like to ask you, Hamy, to comment on a topic that is very much in circulation in regard to the power sector in the United States right now, which is the topic of resilience, resilience of our energy systems. What is the implication of renewable power, more renewable power, especially from solar, wind, including from distributed resources, for the resilience of power systems going forward? And maybe just at the same time, let's take this question from this gentleman here, and so that, please, go ahead.
Ravi Vergas from Imperial College. Just on the distributed generation piece, could you maybe first talk about the differences you're seeing between residential and the C&I markets, and could you maybe elaborate on some of the policies you were talking about in terms of accelerating that growth? Thank you.
So on the system integration or resilience, energy security, electricity security. So as I said, 90% of our forecast is solar and wind, which means variable globally. And we looked at this analysis. I didn't show it here. Now, majority of solar and wind generation is in countries where you see 5 to 10% share of variable renewables. In 2023, the significant majority of wind and solar generation will be in countries to 10 to 20% share of variable renewables. So only wind and solar, including India, China, United States, and so on and so forth. EU is already at a level which is super high. So one important point here, system integration is not a technical issue. It's a cost issue. I mean, you can, we keep saying this, it's about the cost. You can simply install everywhere utility scale battery storage and deal with it. It will be very expensive though, right? So the way that to deal with it, we did this analysis, our system integration unit works on this. We categorize countries in 6 phases. Phase 1, 2, 3. And then when you move, phase 1 is basically below 5%, which we pointed out that you shouldn't have any problems with existing sources. Then you move to 10%, 20, and ultimately over 50. And then, of course, you need to start prioritize tap the cheapest options, such as demand-side response. such as better optimization of the power system, such as better meteorological forecast. All these help a lot, actually, significantly. And then when you move towards more than 20%, you also need to think about additional flexibility sources and new transmission capacity, and so on and so forth. But there are layers of different cost options which we do very close analysis in order to tackle that. When you reach in some European countries about 50–60%, you are coming to a point where you need to think about a whole energy system, not only electricity, how you can use the thermal storage in the water heaters in homes, or electric car storage in the coming years, how you can deploy them back and forth into the system, how you can use aggregators to balance the system in a different way. So the world will move towards that direction, and there are very, very good examples of this in the world, already in Europe, and I think market design should move towards that direction to allow this kind of pricing mechanisms in order to deal with it. On the distributed generation, most of our forecast is from commercial and industrial applications, smaller extent on the residential side. The challenges, when we talk about, we did this analysis in the book as well, in what countries pure self-consumption it makes sense, for instance. We did this analysis compared to retail prices. And many Southern European countries where the electricity prices are high, there's a lot of business case which is growing in Italy, Spain, about pure self-consumption economics, we call it, which means you have a great resource, the prices are cheaper, you save money by not using on retail price if regulation allows. That's the biggest uncertainty. I'm coming to your uncertainty question. The uncertainty remains the regulation, because the retail structures are changing, retail price structures are changing. There are many stakeholders who want to influence that. In many countries, the reason why it's not growing because the retail price is subsidized, which means it's so low, such as in India, that it doesn't make sense in the residential sector to grow. But in the commercial sector, in China as well, the prices are much higher. So we will see more and more companies thinking about how we can save money out of our bill by putting solar PV panels if the regulation allows. The other question beyond the self-consumption is, what do you do with your excess generation, right? Because you cannot always consume at the same time. You have an excess generation. And these are the policies that we looked at, which are changing a lot. So, for instance, California just changed its policy. It also depends on the market itself. For instance, the solar PV investment cost of a residential system in California is 4 times higher than the one in Germany today. So, and California is a very experienced market. Why is that? I think we need to focus on how we can reduce these costs. Japan is the same, 5 times higher than Germany. So there's also these differences due to the incentive levels because of the market structure. In some countries, the biggest challenge that is in the United States is the customer acquisition. Companies spend a lot of money in marketing because there is an 8 to 6 month period to basically get the approval from the state. It's just 3 weeks in Germany. You do it online. You know what I mean? There's a big difference in terms of the regulatory environment, which also affects our deployment in the future.
Well, I am unhappy to have to bring this conversation to a close because it has been incredibly rich and deep. I do very much encourage all of you who are interested to read the full report, which is available at the IEA's website. Let me take just a minute or two as I close to talk about a couple of upcoming programs that we will do here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. We try to cover the full landscape of energy policy issues around the globe, from renewables today to conventional fuels to climate change and policies to respond to it, and to the geopolitics of energy. Coming up in the next couple of weeks, we have, actually next Tuesday, one of Hamy's colleagues from the International Energy Agency Jean-Baptiste Debreuil, who will be presenting on the IEA's medium-term market report and global gas security review for 2018, along with Leslie Palti-Guzman of Gas Vista, and our colleague from the center, Akos Loz, who will be speaking about that outlook in natural gas, with Ira Joseph moderating. Then on the 14th of November, we will have a book launch of Triple Axis, Iran's Relations with Russia and China, which is by Dina Esfandiari and Ariane Tabatabai. I hope I didn't butcher those names too badly. That will also be here on the 15th floor in the International Affairs Building. Please join me in thanking Hamy Bahar for his excellent presentation and for taking us through so many different aspects of what is an incredibly dynamic picture. We hope that we can get you back for a 5th round of this presentation at this time next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming.